Hello everyone and welcome to today's IIBA webinar, Exploring the BABOK Guide, Episode 5, CARRDS. I'd like to welcome everyone, and wherever you are around the world, I'm talking to you from Ottawa, Canada. I'm the Head of Learning and Development for IIBA. I have quite a few years as a business analyst in many different sectors, but I'm really enjoying my position here at IIBA because I have a passion for helping people to make the most out of their career and helping them to create a path for themselves to have a satisfying and successful career. Today's webinar is structured in such a way that allows you to share your opinions, to gain insight into business analysis, discover information about our standard, our internationally recognized standard, the IIBA BA Body of Knowledge or BABOK Guide, and expand your view on the profession. It's made up of our three panelists I will be introducing fairly soon, and they'll be discussing the topic for today and sharing their experience and knowledge with you. So today's episode is Episode 5, Constraints, Assumptions, Risks, Requirements, and Dependencies. I will call it CARRDS for today. One of our member benefits is called Best Practices for Business Analysis, and I thought I'd tell you about it today because our preeminent Julian Sammy from IIBA, who's probably, in my opinion, the foremost expert on the BABOK, has written a peer-reviewed journal called, you guessed it, CARRDS. And so you can find that under the Professional Development tab on our website and just scroll down and look for Best Practices for Business Analysis. We release one of these each month, and so you'll also see other peer-reviewed journals. So enjoy. Today's session, well, I'll introduce our speakers, and our panelists are going to provide their opinions and discuss the definition of CARRDS, the role of the PM and BA as it relates to this, and CARRDS and business analysis itself. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. We have Amanda Bennett, who actually lives fairly close to me in Ottawa, Canada. She works at the Carleton University, and she has extensive experience in the IT industry, starting in development, and has a good background in web development and then branched into business analysis and project management. I'd like to congratulate her on obtaining her Certified Business Analyst Professional designation this year and having her PMP certification since 2008. Hi, Amanda.
Hi, greetings from Ottawa and happy spring.
Yeah. We have Charlotte Bonner. She has 20 years of experience in the energy industry and is a leader in not only business analysis but all that goes with the energy industry, energy trading, risk management, oil refinement, compression gas, and water flood application implementations. She's currently pursuing her Doctor of Management degree with a specialization in information systems, and her doctoral dissertation is going to be on the BABOK, the relationship between the BABOK and project success. So you, Julian, you may have a run for your money on an expert on the BABOK. She's also at the faculty of University of Phoenix teaching business systems in energy sector management. Welcome, Charlotte, from somewhere in the United States. You're traveling through the U.S.
Yes, I am. Right now, I'm in my RV in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania.
You gotta love telecommunications. And Julian Sammy, Head of Research and Innovation at IIBA. He has written and is prolific at writing information on business analysis, not only quick tips, but obviously the Better Business Analysis, the peer-reviewed journal. He is a lead in the development of the BABOK Guide version 3 and is a contributing editor. He has had many roles as a business analyst and enterprise business analyst for IIBA, and his new role as head of research and innovation, he's taking that on and will be sharing in future months a lot of what he's discovered. Julian,
Thank you for that glowing recommendation and description of what I do. It's very exciting here at IIBA.
Yeah, and I can't wait for all of the research that you're going to be doing over the next few months and sharing it with the BA community. Well, if you want to ask questions, just type them into the question box. I will be monitoring them, and when the panelists are finished giving their side of their story, I will be asking them questions, and they'll be discussing them. So without further ado, Julian, would you like to start?
Certainly. So the genesis of this article that Maureen mentioned and for this discussion really started quite a few years ago when I was working at a institution in Toronto, and the business analysts who I was working with were having some difficulties. Specifically, they were having real trouble getting things like constraints and assumptions and dependencies dealt with effectively. They could write requirements and do wonderful non-functional requirements, and they could raise some risks, and that was fine. But then you get these constraints, for example, in the introduction to a requirements document, and those will get looked at once and then never looked at again. Or they'd put a list of assumptions in, and the only way, there's a typo here, it's not you signed of, it's you signed off. The assumptions would only be brought up when something went wrong and you needed someone to blame. And dependencies became an I told you so. Well, I told you we needed that. If that's not there, then it's not my fault that it didn't work. And I would characterize all of these as unusable representations of needs and unusable representations of change. Anyone who's been on these webinars before or read any of the stuff I've been working on for the business analysis core concept model, the BACCM, probably is aware that some of the definitions that we've been using are changing. So requirement becomes a usable representation of a need. Usable means somebody's got to be able to do something with it. And a risk is a usable representation as well. Next slide, please. When you are writing a constraint or writing an assumption or writing a dependency, as far as I've been able to tell, you can always restructure those or rephrase them either as a risk, which is about a potential loss, or as a requirement, which is usually about a potential gain. It's not 100% always loss and always gain, but the definition of risk that I'm certainly using as a working definition is always about loss. I know that the ISO definition and IIIE and PMI and others talk about risks that can have benefits, but in practice, basically nobody uses that definition. And as business analysts who are trying to communicate effectively with project teams and with a wide range of stakeholders, I figured we should probably take a step back and look at what the dictionary says about risk. And risk always carries a sense of loss in normal conversation. So usable representation just means that somebody else is able to do something, or at least someone is able to do something based on the information. And that brings us to all the processes and all the infrastructure that organizations have to manage risks, to manage requirements. Next slide, please. When you take advantage of all of that stuff, you can get a lot more done. All that infrastructure, what project managers can do to manage risks, what organizations can do to control change to requirements, and so on. And really, the transformation from CAD to CARD is pretty simple. You can rephrase any given constraint, assumption, or dependency as a risk if it's about the change itself, and you can rephrase any particular constraint, assumption, or dependency as a requirement if it's about the solution itself. Basically, that's it. It's not that hard to do, and when you start to do that, you don't need to change your templates, and you don't need to update the processes or create a new standard. You can just start talking about the constraint, for example, and asking, well, how constraining is it? Is it something that's going to prevent the project from happening, or is it something that's going to affect the way that the solution operates? And let's figure out what would happen if it was broken, if the constraint was broken. And all of a sudden, you've got a requirement or you've got a risk. So that's my opinion, and I'm very curious to hear the opinions of the folks, of Amanda and Charlotte. So I'm going to hand it back to Maureen to take us further.
Well, thank you, Julian, and very interesting. So, Amanda, take it away.
Hi. So, Julian, I liked your comments there, and I have to agree with you that I've noticed before that constraints can be reworded as requirements or risks, depending on how you look at it, and so I have to agree with you there. In terms of the roles, there's some gray area between the project manager and the business analyst in just about every project that I've worked on, and so I'm going to try to shed some light on that here today. As far as the project manager goes, they're always looking at the elements of CARRDS through the lens of the project. And so their big concern, of course, is the triple constraint, the scope, the cost, the schedule. And they're always on the lookout for anything that's going to impact that. So to give you some examples of the different elements of CARRDS, if we're talking about project constraints, an example of that could be the schedule, or schedule constraints. Or resources. There could be a limited number of resources to work on a project. In terms of project assumptions, an example of that could be project X will be completed before project Y. In terms of project risks, an example of that could be that hardware may not hardware may not be delivered on time and will hold up the setup and configuration of a system. An example of a project requirement could be 3 new servers need to be purchased for a website. For project dependencies, an example of that could be that project X must be completed before project Y in order to free up the resources needed to work on project Y. So in terms of the BA role in CARRDS, if I could get the next slide, please. So the business analyst is looking at CARRDS from the business perspective, of course. So an example of a business constraint could be that you can only accept X number of applications for a given process. And so all my examples are going to be from the IT perspective, because that's where I've always worked. But perhaps Charlotte could give examples from a different industry. So an example of a business assumption would be, for example, specific wording for system emails will be provided at a later time, not at the time the requirements are written. An example of a business risk, the client may change requirements, which is, of course, a risk in just about all projects. An example of a business requirement, this is pretty obvious, but just to throw one out there, an email notifications sent to individuals based on system events. An example of a business dependency could be users require training on how to use the system. So that's how I see the different perspectives for the PM and the BA. They both have responsibilities as far as CARRDS go, I think. It's just they look at it in different ways, and they both can contribute to the success of the project. So I'll turn it back to Maureen now.
Okay, just coming off mute. Hi, everybody. Well, I learned something new from Amanda today on project management, so this was good for me. Charlotte, would you like to give your opinion on business analysis and requirements?
Yeah, my experience echoes what Amanda just said, and of course Sammy had wonderful insights into the individual components of CARRDS. My point of view is to look at this whole topic sort of from the perspective of a RACI chart, where each individual and each task is identified so that a task like requirements, the business analyst has responsibility for that task. And for assumptions, constraints, and dependencies, very often the PM has overriding responsibility for those tasks. But if you look at the RACI, there's also, there's responsible, there's accountable, there's contributing, and there's informed. And I think that any task where the PM is responsible, the BA is also accountable for providing input and assisting the project manager in that task. So business analysts elicit requirements. We're the responsible part of the project team for requirements. However, you're going to discover assumptions while you're pulling those requirements out of the business. There will be things that the business stipulates that aren't really part of the IT project requirements, but they're prerequisites for everything else to continue. So even though the business analyst may not be responsible for documenting those assumptions, they're certainly accountable for discovering some of those assumptions. And with constraints and dependencies, the business analyst is certainly accountable for escalating any constraints and dependencies they may come in contact to make sure that the project manager has full oversight over the project. Next slide. In our role of eliciting requirements and developing test plans, user acceptance testing, a very unique position where we stand in between business users and the IT project team. And I like to say that a business analyst is the translator between the IT technical people like developers and your business people out in the field. So that means that because business analysts have that unique insight into what actually is taking place with the users in the field, the business analyst will often be the very first person on the project team that knows of an emerging risk or issue. And even though we're not responsible for risks and issues, that's the project manager's realm, we certainly have an accountability to escalate risks and issues to the project manager and to the business owner. Again, we kind of stand in between those two groups of people. I like to say that the best possible relationship between a business analyst and a project manager is creative tension. We each have a different viewpoint of what should be happening in the project, and there should always be some tension there and some discussion going on as project managers focus on budget and schedule, and as business analysts focus on requirements and user acceptance. So there should always be some tension and some back and forth between the business analyst and the project manager. And in my experience, that's why the business analyst and the project manager can't be the same person. It's real hard to have that creative tension with yourself. So that's my point of view, and I'll kick it back over to Maureen, and let's see what kind of questions and discussion we have out there.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. And Charlotte, some great opinions there. And so I'll start off with Awese, and I apologize, Awese, if I pronounced your name wrong. And welcome back to the webinar, by the way. He has an opinion that I'd like to throw out, and I'll start with you, Charlotte. He says, I differ with the opinion here. In practice, we only consider constraints, and, assumptions, and dependencies that are not translated into requirements. Rather, they drive the solution option, scope, and help us have a common understanding.
Well, you know, that's a very, very valid point, and I can really see in specific situations how that might be. I speak from my experience, and in any given project, I could very much see that kind of division of labor. But I think even if somebody else has the responsibility for that element, the business analyst still, we're the one with our ear to the ground, and we have a real ethical responsibility to make sure that our opinions are voiced in the project.
Julian, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm going to jump in. I think what the audience member whose name I've already lost, because I'm terrible with that kind of thing, the statement was that something like constraints, assumptions, and dependencies would be used to to choose solution options or to winnow down design constraints, that kind of thing. But those would be requirements, wouldn't they? I mean, aren't business requirements the thing that you use to make decisions about what kind of solution options would be appropriate, whether it's build or buy or in whatever domain? Requirements aren't always written down as the system shall, and sometimes they're not even written down. Sometimes they're part of a simulation, or they're part of a prototyping activity, or proof of concept, or something more dynamic than a text document or a spreadsheet. So I think that for this conversation, we need to recognize that the scope of what we're talking about here is quite broad, and rightfully so, because business analysis is pretty broad too, and we do a lot of work. And I certainly agree with Charlotte that we have a real ethical responsibility to be heard, to make ourselves heard, and to make our understanding known. I think that one of the ways that we can really be very effective at doing that is by using language that decision makers understand. And I'll tell you, a lot of decision makers are pretty well versed in language of risk. When you point out what they're going to lose, they tend to pay attention. Andrea, did you want to add something?
Any other thoughts on this?
Can you repeat what that question was again? Because I didn't quite hear it all.
Oh, no problem. I have to find it now. I'm stuck. Sorry. I have to scroll down. My apologies. Okay, I differ with the opinion. In practice, we only consider constraints, assumptions, and dependencies that are not translated into requirements. Rather, those things drive the solution options, scope, and help us have a common understanding.
I understand the perspective on that. I tend to lean towards what Julian is saying, though. Like, I've noticed it myself that if you just toy with the wording of a requirement versus a constraint versus a risk versus an assumption, you could turn it into different things. And I think they're all useful, though, because writing them in different ways just gives a more holistic view of whatever the issue is. And so it is helpful to list all of them separately, the constraints, assumptions, risks, requirements. But yeah, I do have to agree that they could be rewritten to be either one of those things.
Well, so what's the advantage of writing them separately? I have a question. What's the benefit of writing them separately? I mean, if you have a template where these things are managed closely and really people take advantage of them or really do use them, then I can certainly see that. But at the end of the day, the reason that we write down something like an assumption is because we don't actually believe that it's 100% true. The reason we write down constraints is because we're worried about the boundary and dependencies we're not sure that we can depend on. And all of those things are, they end up, eventually, if they're managed well, they'll end up becoming risks or requirements. So, I mean, I personally like to minimize the amount of typing that I have to do, and haven't really gotten a lot of value out of having separate lists of those things. So I guess I'm curious about what conditions would make that more beneficial.
Julian, this is Charlotte. I'll jump in on that question. Requirements tend to be a document by themselves because you need to get the business to sign off on the requirements so that they can be fairly static moving into design and development. Now, there'll always be changes down the road, and you need a change management process to deal with those. But requirements are fairly static. The issues, the risks, the dependencies, those are going to change much faster. And what I've seen many projects use is a separate spreadsheet from the requirements and have a tab for the risks, for the assumptions, etc., so that on a regular basis those can be reviewed and say, okay, has this risk gone away? Did we fix this? Or is this risk now escalated to an issue and something we must deal with? Is this assumption valid? Can we put a stamp on it and say, yes, this is a valid assumption? Or can we say, you know, that assumption that we thought early on in the project just isn't valid, and let's take it off the list, and it belongs maybe in the risk category. So I think it's useful to at least maintain two registers, one for the requirements and one for those things that are more changeable.
I agree with you on that, certainly, because risks shouldn't be documented the same way that you document requirements, because you have to manage them in a very different way. It's when we start talking about the constraints and assumptions and dependencies, like what you were just saying, is that you should manage those assumptions into risks over time. You have to test them or validate that they're real. And you know, the definition of assumption is something that you're not going to validate because you assume that it is true. So I think in practice, two lists is absolutely critical. And by the way, it really helps with communication between the BA and the PM and roles and responsibility. But I still don't see a reason for more than two lists unless there is some specific like process, for example, that a design team uses where they manage dependencies the way that a PM would manage risks or something like that. I've just never encountered anything like that.
OAC would like to jump in, and he says, whoops, it just disappeared from my screen, so bear with me. Someone else has a comment too. I have a great conversation online here. He says, the reason writing a CAR separately is to help project stakeholders understand them in correct context, plus they have their own management cycle. Any comments on that? I think he's kind of mirroring what you're saying, Charlotte.
Yeah, I have seen a business owner who took responsibility for managing the list of risks and translated all the IT risks into business language. And that was effective for that particular business owner to communicate with his superiors. But I've only seen that once, and it was very effective on that project. But most of the time I see that as a very introspective IT process.
If I can jump in.
Sure.
If I can make an analogy, like as to the purpose of writing each list separately, I think of, you know, all the different modeling tools that are available to BAs, and, you know, there's overlap between some of them, but each one is useful in giving you a different view of something, and that's the way I kind of see, you know, the constraints, the assumptions, risks, and dependencies. They're giving you different views, and you might think of something that you wouldn't have thought of if you were just keeping the one list. That's the way I kind of see that, and so I'm for keeping all those lists separately. Yeah.
Well, thank you. There's quite a few questions here, but I have a particular question that relates to, I believe, your second slide, Julian, and I'd like to go to that slide. And just bear with me as I move to it. one of the participants would like you to just restate your opinion on risk and requirements.
So the risks and requirements are fundamentally usable representations of something. They are information that somebody will take action on. They are explicitly about taking action. In the case of requirements, usually you're trying to gain some value somehow through a development effort, through building something, through changing something. And with risks, usually you're trying to avoid or mitigate some potential loss. You're trying to prevent a bad thing from happening or handle it if the bad thing does happen. So they're deeply related. Risks tend to be things that affect plans, or that you, excuse me, you make plans to avoid, whereas requirements tend to be things that you structure into a coherent set so that you can do something specific.
And so, as it relates to your last slide, could you paraphrase how risk and requirements work with each other?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Could you paraphrase as well? This particular slide about risk is about the change, and requirements is the solution.
Sure. Yeah. So requirements, as usable representations of a need, they are generally about the solution, right? They are focused on what is the end state going to be, how will the business operate when we're done, what will the solution doing, all those kinds of things. Risks, as Charlotte had pointed out, are much more changeable, and you deal with them as part of the change, as part of the activities associated with the change. So if you have a constraint or an assumption or a dependency that is really like we may not have enough resources to be able to meet our timelines. Meeting the timelines for the change is about the change, and so that would quite rightfully fit into risks. If you had another constraint, we may not have enough resources to operate the solution when we're done because there's a hiring freeze. Is that really a risk, or do you put in requirements that talk about the human resources that are necessary to build the bridge, or to operate and maintain the bridge, or to run the assembly line? And that's where you can, sometimes one idea can drive both, but most of the time you can pretty clearly write a requirement based on whether it is about the solution, or write a risk based on whether it's about the change.
Thanks. Pardon me. Thanks for that. And Marlena asks, with regard to potential loss and risk, how do we approach that conversation with the business, and what types of losses? You gave us some good examples, but when we're talking to the business, what types of losses should we be referring to when we're talking to the business about risk or potential loss?
This is Charlotte. I'll jump in on that one. As a business analyst, I've always worked very, very closely with business people developing the business case for the project. The project manager comes up with schedule and budget of what the IT side is going to spend to create the solution, but the business really has to understand what the benefit of that solution is. And while you're going through that discussion, that can happen many, many times during a project, particularly as you get into design and development, and the business says, oh, I need this additional piece of functionality, and you have to start the conversation of, well, this is what the impact of that additional piece of functionality is going to do to the budget and schedule. Now, how much dollars and cents or barrels of oil is that additional functionality worth to the business? And then there has to be a decision about, well, it's worth a lot, therefore we're willing to, take the hit to the budget and the schedule because our return on investment is going to be so high. So I think when you're communicating with the business, to think in terms of the business case or the ROI, that's really what's meaningful to the business.
Any other comments on what's meaningful to the business about risk and the impact to requirements?
This is Amanda. I think anytime that there's any impact to the quality of the product that's being delivered in a project, then you want to be having that conversation with the business, with the client, with the stakeholders in the business. And anytime there's an impact to when it's going to be delivered as well, of course you want to be having that conversation with the business.
Yeah, I always think of these things in terms of like what does the business care about? So if you take any requirement or any of these things and turn it inside out and ask what happens if we don't have that, or if we can't meet the schedule, or if if any of those kinds of call them constraints, then you can often find a way of describing what might be lost to business people in terms that they really understand, and it can be simple. I guess the only other point I'd want to make there is that sometimes the things that we think of as business risks are not the things that will motivate your stakeholder to take the appropriate action. And as a BA, you may need to, I don't know, find ways to talk about the personal risk associated with a problem. For example, if we're not going to have enough resources to run the machine after it's built, somebody's going to look bad. Who's going to look bad, and how do you phrase things in a way that makes them aware that they're going to look bad and maybe gets them to have some more skin in the game? Not to be manipulative or anything.
Well, when is it manipulative, and when is it just trying to create that understanding? I mean, this goes back to, as business analysts, we have an ethical responsibility to escalate our opinions. If we see something that's not right, we have a responsibility to make that visible. And I'm not sure manipulative is the right word. I think it's making those things understandable.
Yeah, I'd go further. I'd say manipulative is actually absolutely not the right word, but I don't know what the right word is, because there isn't really a word in English that means to cause you to have an opinion or an idea that you think is your own for your own good that really helps you. Breaking and redecorating, is it a crime? Oh, I got a new sofa. What BAs do, we do some of that con artist kind of stuff. We help people have realizations that they can't have by themselves for their own good. And using, this is part of why I'm passionate about using risk and the language of risk effectively, because risks really do motivate people. Loss is a powerful motivator. And if you can find ways as a BA to describe things in terms of loss, that doesn't mean to be negative all the time, but to think about ways to talk about what could be lost or what you might miss out on, then you can really help people take good action.
Yeah, I think that comes back to being able to talk about the business case. And I really think business analysts have to have a huge role in developing the business case, because we're the interface between the IT team and the business.
So playing a little devil's advocate here, what about the BAs who never get a chance to go near a business case? It's handed to them from one enterprise silo into into the project. It's already been defined. The budget's set and the contracts have been signed. And now what do I do? I know a lot of BAs in that situation.
I have been in that situation, but as the business analyst, I think in order to do a good job on requirements and to help the business prioritize those requirements, you need to at least have a solid understanding of that business case. You really can't make recommendations on what functionality is high priority or low priority unless you do understand the business viewpoint on what they're going to gain from that functionality. So even if you're not developing the business case, you certainly need to be well versed in it.
Yeah, I agree with that as well, and that is my situation here where I don't have a role in the business case. So whenever I start a new project, I pretty much devour the project charter and the initial project proposal and make sure I have a really solid understanding of what's being asked for, and I have to work with what I'm given and take it from there.
So what do you do? I mean, this sounds like the classic help me understand kind of question, right? Help me understand what we're trying to achieve here, which is a very non-threatening way of raising some of this stuff. But what do you do when you know, there's clearly a huge gap in what you've been given, Amanda? Like, you know, the objectives are, they don't make as much sense as they need to, and value isn't going to be delivered.
So if that's the conclusion that I come to, I would definitely take it back to the project manager and raise the issues. As Charlotte said, you have to, it's your ethical responsibility to raise the issues as you come across them and make sure everybody hears it loud and clear what your concerns are.
Now, there's a certain amount of personal risk inherent in that. You know, if you're raising issues, you need to think about what the potential mitigation of those risks or issues might be. There are a lot of management people out there that don't want to hear problems, they only want to hear solutions. And even if your first suggestion for mitigating a risk isn't awesome, it'll at least keep them from turning off their ears and saying, oh, this person's just a worrywart and keeps bringing up problems. If you can bring up a risk and at least one potential mitigation, that makes it an easier conversation. But again, even though there's personal risk in escalating these things, you still need to do it.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Charlotte. And whenever I've raised issues in the past, it usually comes right back to me, so how are you going to solve that, Amanda? And so I usually come prepared with at least one response to that question. So, yeah, you're exactly right.
Yeah, that makes complete sense to me. I don't know any BAs who are good BAs and also not brave. You need to be able to stand up. And also, what you guys have just described is being an advisor, not just saying, here's the problem, and then sort of tossing it over the wall to somebody else. You're talking about being prepared to give advice about options and recommendations. And I think that's a big change over the last couple of years. So a lot of BAs were very uncomfortable with that idea of recommending a solution to any kind of a problem. So it's interesting to hear you say that.
We might also be talking about the evolution from a brand new BA to higher skill levels to a senior BA to an enterprise BA. I mean, it can very often happen that the only BA on the project is not somebody with 15 years experience, and they just don't have the background to be able to make good suggestions. And I think that speaks to why it's good to have a community of practice or a center of excellence, or heck, refer back to the BABOK.
Yeah, very good point. Anybody who you can find with more experience, who you can ask questions, like this kind of a panel is awesome for that kind of thing. But getting that advice from somebody who's seen something like this before is very, very helpful. Made a big difference. Certainly made a big difference for me as a young BA, you know, trying to make a mark in the world. And the advice of the folks we had in our Center of Excellence was invaluable.
Well, there's quite a few comments here about the definition of manipulation. As we, you know, as BAs, we're advisors, well said, to compel, to educate, convincing, like politicians. I thought these were great comments from the audience. And One last comment on risk before we move to some other aspects of CARDS. Tina says risk can also be there if the problem cannot be defined. Right? The why are we doing this in the first place? That should raise a red flag.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot, where there's an initial, usually reaction rather than something proactive to some situation, and people get, like decision makers drive right into taking an action, and I mean that's their jobs, right? That's what that's why we have people in positions of power and authority. It's to take action. But that can also be the great downfall, because the instinctive first reaction is often based on fear and anxiety rather than being based on risk. Because risk and fear are not the same thing. The thing, I'm afraid of sharks. I live near Lake Ontario. There are no sharks for me to be afraid of. There is no risk of me getting eaten by a shark. But that's how people tend to react. So you know, the good BA needs to be able to help those leaders take a step back or take a breath and see what's really going on.
Well, thanks for that.
That makes me think of my least favorite user acceptance testing requirement, and that's that the users of the new application need to be comfortable with the user interface. I have no idea how to measure comfortable, and I've been doing this for a long time.
Well, first you need an MRI machine.
Certainly raise some red flags.
You need an MRI and a polygraph, and you know, you run some trials with electric shocks to see what discomfort looks like. Oh, it's totally doable.
Well, this might be a good segue into a question on assumptions for Amanda from Emily. Mm-hmm. Would an assumption about the organizational readiness for a change, e.g., assume that the end users are ready for the change, be an assumption from the BA or from the PM perspective?
That would not be a good assumption to make from any perspective. A part of organizational readiness assessments is determining, is the business prepared for the end product, and so to state an assumption like that is probably setting up the project for failure. You shouldn't be making an assumption like that's not a good assumption to make. So I would say that the organizational readiness assessment would have to determine if the business is ready for it, and you just should not have an assumption like that stated in the project.
And that's something that can be a measurable metric. You can create a survey early in the project for the stakeholders and then repeat that same survey later on as you're getting ready to deploy, and you can measure the change in the responses from your stakeholders and word the question in such a way that they are measuring, you know, like on a sliding scale, number 1 to 10, you know. Do you feel like you have enough information about, and you can actually measure the change in your stakeholders over time, and that can make that whole discussion less of a perception and more of a measurable metric.
That's a really cool idea.
So in essence, what you're saying is organizational readiness is part of the requirements. Would you say that's true?
It's certainly a necessary part of change management. I wouldn't think of it as a functional requirement, but it's certainly a necessary part of change management.
Yeah, you see, I see it as a business requirement that costs money, takes time, and uses resources. So I often would put in what the organizational change requirements were as part of the communication plan, and it always sort of fell to me as the BA. Probably because I was more of a process BA, less of a technical BA, sort of a business systems analyst, if you will.
I have seen requirements for training material that said, you know, the training material must be in the form of a written set of instructions. There must also be a desktop, one-page shortcut key. There must be, you know, I have seen very specific requirements around training, which probably speaks to that same thing.
Any other thoughts on assumptions and their role in requirements?
Well, I wanted to just make a note with this discussion about organizational readiness. I mean, there's a reason why there's a task for that. And you know, the outputs of that task frequently are not just requirements, they're risks. So it's worth taking another look at the BABOK and the organizational readiness assessment because I've seen, I'm sure we've all seen projects that have gone pear-shaped because, you know, it'd be so easy if it wasn't for these users. And you know, then they fail.
Well, I'm sure we've all seen projects that were 100% successful from the IT project point of view with zero user adoption.
I heard somebody, I can't remember who it was, say that the best software is the software that is misused. The worst software is the software nobody uses at all. And I mean, how many features and functions never get used in applications? Yeah, it's IT success is not the same as business success. And boy, oh boy, we are business analysts, not, you know, tool analysts.
Yeah, and whether it's a failure on the business side or it's a failure on the IT side, overall it's a failure, and nobody looks good if the business wasn't prepared for the end product.
Yeah, Mark Stanley says the assumption on change management is probably better as a risk.
Could be.
Yeah, I think there's, oh, go ahead.
No, that was it.
Yeah, I guess this would be a case where you may find that there are both risks and requirements that get driven out from that kind of assessment. Because, you know, on the risk side, what if they're not ready, and you know we have a time to market constraint that we have to deal with? Well, what are the implications for that, and what are the requirements that are related to making sure that the organization is ready? And so, in a sense, you can have requirements that are part of the mitigation plan. You know, you have to do stuff, and maybe you have to build stuff to be able to address the risk one way or another. So there, as a business analyst, years ago I used to hear a lot of BAs who would say, "Oh, I don't deal with risks. I might raise them and then I give them to the PM to manage," and that's sort of okay, but it's not really okay because you can end up not dealing with things that you really need to deal with.
Yeah, that might be okay in principle, but if you like your job, I think a BA needs to be concerned about risks as well.
Well, I think it comes back to that whole thing about ethical responsibility.
Yeah, I think you're right on that, and you know, we've been talking about this from a IT project perspective primarily, but this stuff applies to any business analysis in any perspective for any kind of a change. You can be doing continuous improvement, and you still need to have a sense of both of these things, of risks and requirements, and be able to articulate, you know, the constraints, the assumptions, and the dependencies in a way that allows people to take action.
Exactly. This is a question for Amanda. If you could, someone's requested that we just get a couple of examples on the differences between CARRDS as it relates to PM and CARRDS as it relates to BA. So I thought I'd bring up your slides so that you could give us a few examples, and then maybe the panelists could chime in after you finish the PM role, and the BA role. We can have a little discussion about this.
Okay. I can just reiterate what I had said earlier. I provided some examples of those things, but I can go through them again, if that works.
I think
so, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it'll be a great refresher and a good discussion.
Okay. So an example of a project constraint, of course, the classic example would be the triple constraint of scope, cost, schedule, right? A BA wouldn't necessarily be concerned with those things, but of course a project manager has to be. An example, should I pause at each one or continue on?
No, just go through and then we'll have a discussion. Great.
Okay. So a project assumption might be that project X will be completed before project Y. Like on a recent project I was on, there were resources used for one project that were the same as what was used for a later project. And if the first project ran over the schedule, then we would have had problems resourcing the second project. So we had to proceed with both projects, but with the assumption that project X would be completed before project Y began. So for a project risk, an example of that would be that hardware is going to be delivered on time, may not be delivered on time, sorry, and could hold up the setup and configuration of that hardware. Example of a project requirement would be that, let's say you're delivering a website, well maybe that website will need 3 new servers purchased. That would be a project requirement. An example of a project dependency would be that project X must be completed before project Y, and I'll go back to that example I just gave. And this is also an example of what Julian was saying, how things can be reworded to mean different things as far as CARRDS go. So like the dependency for project X and project Y is that project X has to be completed before project Y can begin in order to free up the resources needed to work on project Y.
I have a question for you. When you say project requirements, are you talking about transition requirements? Like, are those synonyms?
Well, there's different kinds of requirements for a project. And the example I gave, yes, you could say that would be a transition requirement.
Okay. I just wanted to test my understanding because there are a lot of different ways that there are a lot of ways that quote unquote project requirement could be interpreted. Thanks.
Sure. Okay. So in terms of examples of the BA's perspective on CARRDS, an example of business constraint could be that you can only accept X number of applications for a given process. An example of a business assumption, specific wording for system emails will be provided at a later time, not at the time that the requirements are written. An example of a business risk would be that clients may change their requirements, which is pretty standard for any project. An example of a business requirement, which is fairly obvious, but email notifications sent to individuals based on system events. An example of a business dependency would be that users require training in how to use the system. So how does that work for everybody?
Thank you for that.
Amanda, it really works well for me because this is my feeling on the whole topic, is that the business analyst and the PM have different perspectives looking at the exact same element. So they can be looking at the same risk and come at it from two entirely different lenses and have very different thoughts about what to do about it. And I think it speaks to the creative tension between the BA and the PM.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And you know, this whole conversation, I keep thinking, boy, oh boy, is it ever great when you're working with a project manager who really cares about business analysis. And isn't it great when a project manager has a BA who cares about project management? Because they serve different purposes, and that dynamic tension is extremely effective.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, that's the perfect world.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it doesn't happen all that often, where you get both that are engaged.
Unfortunately, sometimes we get the tension without the creative part.
Yeah, exactly.
It is getting better. There are more PMs who understand more about business analysis, and it tends to be in that direction. It tends to be that BAs understand more about project management. But you know, when you start using the language that your stakeholders understand, like talking risk and schedule and stuff with a project manager, it can really build your credibility, and it can make for very powerful partnerships.
Well, as always, this webinar is never long enough. We have about a half a minute left, and I'm going to close with a statement by Kevin, who says, do the panelists agree there is a distinction between project requirements versus solution requirements, and that the PM is responsible for project and the BA is responsible for the solution?
I think that project managers are responsible for managing a change and you know, using a specific kind of methodology to do that, and that project managers have a lot of requirements, but you don't write them as requirements because that wouldn't be useful. You write them other ways.
I would have to go back to what Charlotte said about the responsible versus accountable. I think in terms of the BA being responsible for solution requirements, yes, that's correct, but it's not like the project manager has no role there either. Like, they would be accountable as well. So I don't know, Charlotte, maybe you'd like to elaborate more on that.
No, I absolutely agree. When you're talking about who's responsible and who's accountable, there can be really fuzzy lines depending on what the project is. But anything that is a project management task, I think a BA has some role in making suggestions or assisting with that task. And it works the other way as well. Anything that's a solid BA deliverable, that doesn't mean the project manager doesn't need to review that document and understand it.
Well, and with that, I think that was a great closing statements on our roles out there. I can't thank the panelists enough for their insight, their experience. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, Amanda. And as always, thank you, Julian.
You're welcome.
You're welcome. Thanks for all this discussion, guys. This is great.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was fun.
Well, and to our guests and attendees, thank you for joining in on the discussion. Some great comments. I wish we could have gotten to all your comments and questions, but don't forget this will be posted with the audio in 5 business days, and don't forget to join us again for another webinar. Thank you very much.